Well, hey, everybody, it's your boy, Mr. Perry, and here we are back at it again, talking about the Create Task rubric. This time we're going to concentrate on rows 4 and 5 because both of these rows are related to how your program is going to use a function or procedure and this whole concept of procedural abstraction. So let's get into it. First off, row 4. In order to score the point on row 4, you have to give them two program code segments. The first one has to show where the function or procedure has been defined, and it needs to include a parameter. So the first program code, again, is where you're defining the program, the procedure or the function, and showing how the parameter is a part of it. And then the next code segment has to show where you are calling that function. So that's pretty straightforward. You also have to have a written description that basically identifies what the procedure does and how it contributes to the functionality of the program. So you're going to show them where you create it, you're going to show them where you call it, and you're going to describe what it does in the program. Pretty straightforward. So two images of code segments and one brief paragraph response will get you row 4. This one should be pretty easy. However, row 5 is a little bit trickier. Row 5 is probably the most difficult point to earn on the create task because you basically want to give them a function or a procedure that showcases sequencing, selection, and iteration, and then you need to describe it in enough detail that somebody else could recreate it. So you really have to be very detailed and precise in your description of how your procedure runs and what it does and how it kind of operates step by step. A couple of things to keep in mind. You can go through and read, you can pause and read, in order to get the point, and then mistakes that can cost you the point. But two in particular I want to draw your attention to is an algorithm that contains selection and iteration also contains sequencing. So what that means is if you show them a function that has a loop and inside that loop also has selection, or maybe it has a loop and then outside of the loop uses selection, that means you're also using sequencing. You're basically saying that this happens first, then this happens, then something else happens. And that's all sequencing is where you have step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And then another thing that I'll point out is it says an algorithm that contains sequencing, selection, and iteration that is not contained in a procedure can earn this point. So what that means is if none of your functions or procedures include a loop and if statements, then you can actually get a snippet of program code from elsewhere in your program and use it to earn this point, but that won't earn you both row 4 and row 5. So the easier thing to do, the better thing to do is to use, to have a function or procedure that uses both iteration and selection to earn the point on both of these rows. That just makes the whole thing easier if you can do that. So to get row 5, you do have to write one longer paragraph response. So we'll go ahead and look at what that looks like in just a second here. So the main thing to keep in mind here is with your procedure or function, whatever one you decide to show the College Board, you can just make sure it has at least one parameter. It can have more than one, but make sure it has at least one, and make sure that that parameter is used somehow in selection in order to make different things happen. So make sure that your procedure or function uses selection and that this parameter somehow is involved in it. And then also make sure that it includes iteration, either a while loop or maybe some kind of for loop. The other option is to make sure that wherever your function gets called, if that is inside of a loop, then it will also qualify for this point. But the easier thing to do is just to include iteration in your loop. So this is what it looks like. In my program, I chose the match check function. So here I am defining it. So this is what I would give them for part 1. I've got the definition. I've got my two parameters, first card and second card. And then down here, I've got my while loop. and then I've got my selection right here. So I clearly have iteration, selection, as well as plenty of sequencing happening here as well. Now I also have to show them for part 2, I have to show them where match check gets called. So that ends up on line 133. That's where match check is actually being called with first card and second card parameters, or in this case, arguments. When you call a function, whatever value you pass in is called an argument. Where you define your function or procedure, whatever goes in your parentheses is called your parameter. So basically, arguments and parameters are almost synonymous. They refer to the same value. It's just wherever you call the function, these are your arguments. They get passed in as parameters to the definition of it over here. Anyways, I digress. Let's look at part 3 and 4. So for part 3, super easy. All you have to do is describe what the function does. So, and again, I'm going to call it procedure because the College Board uses the word procedure. The procedure match check is what allows the program to check whether the first and second card are a match. It's that simple. Just describing in a real general sense, what this procedure does in my program. And it's obviously a really important part of the program. But part 4, this is the part where you're going to spend a lot of time just describing what it takes to create this procedure. Now, when you go to write part 4, what I recommend doing is going back to part 1 and just going through this line by line. So line 136 is where I'm defining the procedure and the parameters. So my first sentence is, to create this procedure, the programmer must define it as match check and then pass in the parameters first card and second card. So that's a sentence basically describing this first line. Now, the next 2 lines are my variables that I have to declare as global because they are defined elsewhere in the program. So my second sentence, because this is programmed using Python, the programmer must declare the variables num matches and num guesses as global. All right, so then I'm going to go back and look at what's next. Okay, well, I've got my while loop, and this is going to happen while the number of matches is less than the length of cards divided by 2. I have 12 cards right now, so it would need to have 6 matches before the game was over. So let's look at my paragraph here. Next, use a while loop to keep checking for matches and calling the pick card procedure while num matches is less than half the length of the list cards. So again, that's just more of a plain language version of what's happening in this loop. Now I need to describe the selection and what's happening inside my selection. So nested inside the while loop, use selection to check whether the first card matches second card. If they do match, inform the player using a print statement, then increment both num matches and num guesses variables. Use a print statement to tell the user how many matches they have made. So that was my plain language description of lines 142 through lines 147. But then I also have to describe what happens down here. If they do not match, use a print statement to inform the user and increment the num guesses variable. Finally, add a line of code inside the while loop to call the pick card procedure. So that is taking care of this last little bit down here. Okay. So again, the safe bet on rows 4 and 5 is to make sure that you have a function that uses parameters, has iteration, and has selection. If you can't make that happen, then what you want to make sure to do is that wherever it is you call your function, that this happens inside of a loop. So if this was in some kind of a loop, like a while loop or a for loop, then you could say to the College Board, well, it uses selection, sequencing, and iteration because it's called inside of a loop. And then, of course, the function itself uses selection. But I just think it's easier to make sure that you have one function that does all of those things. All right, hopefully this helps, guys. We've got just one more video in the series, and I'll see you in class.